So I'm just going to introduce the three people who will be participating in this session this afternoon. Our first speaker today is Dr. Dara Wald. She's an assistant professor in the Greenlee School of Journalism here at Iowa State University. She received her master's degree and PhD in wildlife ecology and conservation and a certificate in environmental ed and communication from the University of Florida. And here, her teaching and research is related to science communication and risk communication in particular. Her talk will be followed by Pat Boddy, who is the stewardship director at RDG Planning and Design. Prior to that position, she was the deputy director at the Iowa DNR. And now at RDG, she leads a team to advance the sustainable planning and design for corporations, governments, parks, and communities. And our final speaker is, everyone knows him, Dr. Rick Cruz, or he'd rather be called Poor Rick if you meet him. I think everyone knows who he is, but he's a professor in the Department of Agronomy, whoopsie, and, and the director of the Iowa Water Center. So thank you all for being here today, and please help me in welcoming our first speaker, Dr. Wald.
Thanks for being here this afternoon. Thanks for the lovely introduction. I did come from the University of Florida. That's where I got my master's and PhD in wildlife ecology and conservation. And then I did a postdoc at Arizona State in the Decision Center for Desert City, which some of you may be familiar with. They have a couple of projects, but their main one is on water sim, which is a big simulation model about how water is used in the Phoenix metropolitan area. And in addition to doing that position, I also had a position in the Center for Policy Informatics. And there I looked at policies and how communication can influence policy making and decision making. So this is the sort of my perspective in terms of what I've seen in the last few years in the field and how we engage the public in a conversation about natural resource management. My research for my master's and PhD focused on land and wildlife, and then in my postdoc I transitioned to some projects on water. So my research still continues in these three areas: wildlife, land, and water. And what I'm going to talk about today a little bit is my perspective on sort of some of the models of public participation that exist, why we need public participation, what it looks like, and what some of the challenges of public participation may be. So the first question I ask often when I'm asked to talk about public participation is, what does it look like to you? Everyone has a model in their head of what public participation may or may not look like. And my model in my own head is going to be different from the model of some of you sitting in this room. Your neighbor's model sitting next to you is probably different from the one that you have. And so this question of public participation is challenging, for one, because we all have a different model of what it actually should look like or does look like. And for a long time in the field of natural resource management, public participation was grounded in the idea of a deficit model. It was grounded in the idea that the public doesn't know how to manage resources, that the public decisions are either irrational or uninformed. And so to combat that, we need to just give them the information. We just need to tell them what they need to know. We, the experts, need to provide the information to the public because the public is irrational or does not know the information from the beginning to begin with. And so the deficit model has an expert standing up, a talking head, kind of like I'm doing right now. And in addition to being that talking head, we also give them the information. What is fracking? Why is it important for you? Right? What is public participation and why is it important for you? And as I said, this deficit model assumes that there's this gap in knowledge, right? We, the experts, have the knowledge, and the public doesn't have the knowledge. And so to fix that problem, we need to give them the knowledge. And that's based on two big assumptions. One is knowledge leads to a behavior change. Okay? If I know something, if I know that my behavior, if I know that I can bring my coffee in a reusable cup every single day, I will go out and I will make my coffee every single morning and I will bring it in a reusable cup instead of going out and buying my coffee. Well, there's a lot of other factors that come into play into my decision to make my coffee, right? Maybe I like the taste of my coffee better than the taste of the coffee that's offered. Maybe I don't want to spend the money on buying coffee, right? There's a lot of other decisions that have nothing to do necessarily with my knowledge, knowing that using a reusable coffee cup will be more effective or environmentally friendly. So that's the one big problematic assumption, the idea that knowledge actually leads to behavior change. The other big assumption is that the public doesn't know it. The public doesn't have the right knowledge. When in reality, the public just has a different set of information, a different source maybe of information, a different set of trusted advisors. The public may not believe the information that's out there. They may not believe the source that's coming to them, that's giving that information to them. And so the assumption that the public just doesn't know the knowledge is also problematic. Okay? The deficit model assumes that the public is both irrational and ignorant. Okay? And so the science deficit model, this idea that a talking head can provide all the information, was what really characterized natural resource management for a very, very long time. And it led to these hierarchical models where you have one person or one agency or one organization standing up here at the top and filtering the knowledge down to the public. Okay? Again, assuming that the public doesn't have the knowledge, so we just need to give it to them. Okay? And this has been the dominant approach in natural resource management for a very, very long time. And there are lots of problems with this, beyond what I just talked about, that it's treating the public as ignorant and irrational, but also that it's a focus on the remedial rather than preventative actions. We're not going forward. We're not trying to prevent situations. We're just dealing with them often when they arise. So when the public gets upset, we deal with the issue, but until then, we don't deal with public concerns. It can also create an adversarial rulemaking process where the public doesn't believe that the experts are on their side, that the public doesn't feel like they're a part of that team, right? It's an us versus them situation where the expert provides the knowledge and it's the expert's opinion versus the public opinion. And what can happen when we have these situations is that when the public feels like we're talking at them instead of listening to them. Okay? The public feels like we're not giving them the information that either they care about or that they're concerned about, or that we just don't understand because we're not really hearing what their concerns are, okay? And this is the outcome, this is the reaction to the deficit model approach and to the hierarchical approaches that have for a long time characterized natural resource management situations. The good news is that there has been a shift, and there are a number of organizations doing really fantastic work engaging the public. And we're moving from this hierarchical approach where we communicate to the public to this dialogue where we communicate with the public, or even to participation where we communicate about science among the public, right? Within the public, engaged in a conversation where we both learn, all right? Where both groups learn, both the experts and the public, or some combination of experts and public learn, and where we co-create knowledge, and where public opinion actually contributes to science instead of the scientists bringing their opinion to the public to inform the public. And this is a really positive shift. This is a really great transition, and this is a really great movement away from a hierarchical approach to a much more engaged and participatory approach. And organizations like the Science Royal Society, Public Understanding of Science, you can see this both in journals and in practical organizations, both in research and in actual organizations like the Park Service and others. You can actually start to see the shifts, not just a conversation that's been taking place, but an actual implementation where organizations and agencies are actually trying to engage the public in a much better way. So we are shifting. This is great. We are shifting from hierarchical to participation, certainly in our awareness of that issue, certainly in our awareness of the need to make this shift. But there are still questions about how to do it. Some definitions that have been provided, some ideas that are out there, is that one way that public participation is different from the hierarchical approach that we talked about is that it really shifts attention away from hierarchy to a collaborative approach where it's a team. It's an idea that the public, the experts, everybody in the room that has a stake in the issue is part of this collaborative process. And that communities should come together to pursue common interests. As I said, there are lots of examples. Three that I want to just briefly mention are things like participatory mapping, participatory modeling, where communities come together and actually create a map, either a real live map or a virtual map of their community, of their watershed, where they talk about where their place in that community is and how understanding their place in that community might influence their decisions, how knowing what the watershed looks like might influence their decisions. Another example would be something like participatory budgeting or participatory policy making, where you actually get policymakers and the public in the room together to talk about how different policies, what different policies might cost, what different policies might look like, how you could map those policies across your community. And the last example I want to talk about is at DCDC, at the Decision Center for a Desert City in Phoenix, where we're actually showing this water model to policymakers and to the public, and we're making decisions together. So what happens if we move this lever and we increase the amount of water that's available from the Colorado River? What happens if we increase climate effects over time? What happens if we do X, Y, or Z from a policy perspective? So really asking people to play with the models that exist out there and to make decisions and to see how in real time making those decisions might change what the model looks like, how much water is available, and then we can actually forecast into the future and say, what would Phoenix, Arizona look like in 50 years if we were to make this decision? Okay, so all of those are examples of a more public and participatory approach. The challenges for public participation, or I guess I should before that, some things to think about, some key components of public participation is to understand that you have a balance of objectives. It's no longer just the scientific objectives or the expert objectives, right? What are your stakeholders' objectives? What do they care about? What matters to them? And bringing those objectives into the room, especially when you have differences in power within that community, right? Some groups have a really large voice, have a lot, have historically been engaged in this process, right? How do you engage the folks that haven't historically had power in that process? And how do you bring their objectives to light? Thinking about the non-state actors, the non-expert actors as equally able to coordinate and move the process forward, right? So maybe the participants in the room are the ones that should be doing the legwork instead of just the agencies. So finding a way to engage and really allow them to do it. Understanding again that government alone should not direct decision making. And finally, emphasizing consensus-oriented decision making where it's not where every voice is heard, and acknowledge whether that voice actually ends up being a part of the decision-making process in the end or not is a different conversation. But certainly acknowledging the fact that those individuals' opinions and attitudes should influence the decision-making process, and trying to find as much consensus as possible. So again, what we're moving towards is participation. I don't think we're there yet. I think we still have a lot of work to do. I think the question of what participation actually looks like is still a really big one. How do we actually communicate? How do we actually build trust? How do we actually engage people in a respectful conversation? I think there are a lot of questions out there that still need to be asked, but the switch and the move toward participation is really important. And I think it's important for the next generation of water leaders to be thinking about that. How am I going to engage the public? What are the challenges that are going to come up? And no longer having that question of should I engage the public? I think that is pretty clear that we absolutely should be engaging the public, and the question is how do we do it and how do we do it well? So there are some challenges in public participation, and the first one is that hierarchical systems are really effective, right? Someone says to do it, the next person implements it, and the public, lives with that decision, right? It can be very, very effective. And so a more engaged and collaborative process might be less resilient to really quick decisions that are needed to be made. And they might be less resilient to unpredictability because the system doesn't know how to act, right? You're creating the system as you go along. And so being able to respond to that when you've never responded to those challenges before and you don't have a system in place can be challenging. And so that's certainly one big challenge of public participation. The other challenge is agency norms and values. Just as the public has strongly held beliefs about things that we might look at and say, well, I don't really agree with that, right? Agencies and individuals in agencies have strongly held beliefs and strongly held value and really important values that I think, as I said at the outset, like this has historically been for the last 50 or so, or more than that, years, this has been the dominant approach. Hierarchical structures have been the dominant approach to public engagement. And so the norms in the agencies aren't necessarily going to shift, and they're not going to shift easily, right? So addressing those challenges is going to take time. That's going to take time. Some decision makers may actually reject participatory governance. It's difficult. It's hard. It involves letting go of control and not knowing what's going to happen, right? And that's hard to do for all of us. And so being aware of that, being aware of the fact that there is this fear of the tragedy of the commons, if I let go, if I let the public make this decision, right, what's going to happen to the resource that I really care about? And I'm talking now as an agency representative or as an expert, right? What's going to happen to this resource that I care very much about if I let go and let the public take control of this process, right? That idea of a tragedy of the commons is a very powerful one. And I think that that's another challenge that might come when you try to do participatory public participation. And again, this is just the pathology of natural resource management has focused on command and control, and that has dominated the resource-based conservation for the last 3 decades, right? So that challenge, that historic perspective, that ingrained idea and approach exists. It's out there. You will come into contact with the science deficit model subtly. If you're out working in natural resource management, you will come into contact with that model. You will come into contact with fears of the tragedy of the commons, and you have to be aware of them and aware of the fact that those values and those beliefs, they're grounded in a very long history. And it's going to take some time and effort to change them. But I think it's worth maybe thinking about how we would engage not just the public, but also agency members and folks who've been around for a long time who are dealing with this challenge. And so we know that we need to develop, design our collaborative efforts to engage the public. We know that we need to build trust. We know that we need to encourage commitment to the process and shared understanding, and that leadership is really important, and that all of this will lead to collaborative outcomes. We just have no idea how to do it. And so I think we need to think a little bit really carefully about how we engage the public, how do we build trust, how do we promote shared understanding and commitment, and how do we address the fact that institutionally some of our agencies may or may not be designed to do that. And some of our leadership may or may not be designed to explore that or willing to let go and allow the public in a really engaged and participatory way. And so I think this is our big challenge for natural resource management in the next 20 years. And so just in conclusion, some questions, some thoughts to leave you with. I do believe that public opinion can and should absolutely contribute to the management of water resources and natural resources and to policy decisions. I think we have to think very carefully about how to overcome resistance in public engagement, both from the public in terms of public concern, but also from agency representatives of all kinds, and think about how we can address that resistance. And then last, how do we communicate and collaborate with the public once we do engage them? What tools can we use to effectively communicate? And I think our next speaker is going to spend some time talking about communication skills and strategies. So I'll turn it over to her unless we have questions.
No, I think we'll do questions, discussion, all at the end.
Okay, great. So I'll turn it over to Pat. Thank you very much for your attention.
Do I need a microphone? No. I don't think so. I'd like to start with a little story. Some of you have heard me tell this story before. The reason I'm repeating it is it's a good one. It's a story about a dolphin down at SeaWorld before Blackfish. Thanks. And so what do we try to do with our dolphins down at SeaWorld? We had this trainer. What was the trainer trying to teach the dolphin to do? Bounce a ball on its nose. Okay. So the trainer's trying to teach this dolphin to bounce a ball on its nose, and every time she thinks she's making progress, the dolphin just stops and does she gets so frustrated over and over and over again. She's trying to get the dolphin to bounce the ball on its nose, and it just keeps going. And finally, at the maximum of her frustration, she looks at that dolphin and she goes, backflips, enthusiasm, excitement. And she realizes that the entire time she's been trying to get the dolphin to bounce the ball in its nose, the dolphin has been trying to get her to say, what do we have in common as scientists, or applied scientists, with the dolphin? What?
2 different languages.
We speak 2 different languages. How difficult is that for communication, right? So what I want to touch base with you on is how to overcome some of that language barrier. And then I believe Dr. Cruz is going to give a brief little talk about climate and sustainability. And we're going to try and understand how well he's doing and give him a little critique.
Do you think it's funny?
I'll be brief, but I want to highlight a few things. Okay. One of the things we do in science, and particularly water science, is we get trapped in what? Data. All right, so here are some of our traps. Let's start to list them. Data is a trap. What else?
Language. Jargon.
Pardon?
Jargon.
Data, jargon. What else?
Acronyms.
Acronyms. Subset of jargon and very valid. What else?
Vocabulary.
Vocabulary, absolutely. Tell me some more. Shout them out. I write really fast. That's it? That's all you can think of? These are our only traps?
The unicorn message.
Tell me what the unicorn message
You
is.
just need the right message to get that information into their heads.
That's correct. What else?
Like graphs, graphs and figures they can't understand.
Anybody know what a Gantt chart is?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes our picks are just wrong, right? They're too hard, they're too complicated. What else?
Perception or misunderstanding.
Yes. What do you need to do to overcome these traps? She just told us.
Calling the right message.
No, earlier.
Find out their perception.
Engage the public.
Understand your audience, right? Know where they're coming from. Understand that frame of reference that they're bringing to the table. They have their own frame of reference. That's a little technical term, right? It's their history, their understanding, their expectations. They're walking into a space with a certain amount of expectations, and by golly, if you have no clue what those expectations are, good luck with that. It's going to be very difficult to communicate, especially when you're trying to do it with a different language, right? And I'll add one more here because it just drives me nuts. It's called passive voice. Do we have any other journalists in the room?
No, but I've hung around one for 10 years. She reminds me of it every day.
That's right. So passive voice is very simply, we don't put the subject first. We use the to be verb. So instead of saying, Sammy hits the ball, we say the ball is being hit by Sammy. Now why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem because we're already trying to get rid of data and jargon and acronyms and vocabulary and the right message, and now we've just made it that much harder for people to think and understand what we're trying to say. So the bottom line with science communication is it's just basically good, solid communication. It's participatory, it's as interactive as we can make it, it's as much about listening and understanding as it can possibly be, and the message has to be couched in some relatively simple terms. There's another thing that we get hung up with for a trap. Anybody think what it might be? Yes?
Well, we're really tied to the message that we want to get out, and so we can't give that up, so we got to cover it all. And so a lot of times we talk really, really fast and assume that everybody's keeping up. That's not where you're headed.
No.
Too much detail.
This just happened
Yeah.
today.
Yeah.
The difference between infiltration and percolation, there was a almost dragged down fight about why it was so important to make sure everybody knew the difference between. And it's like, it's watering the ground.
It's watering the ground. Thank you. Did you hear what she just said? What she said was there was almost a drag-down fight earlier today between the difference of infiltration and percolation. It's really just watering the ground, which is getting to kind of what you were saying about the detail. And it's not far off from what you're saying, Jean. This idea that if we just talk really, really fast, we'll get it all out. And it's this hang-up we have with accuracy. Now, okay, that's not sounding good. I understand that. We need to be accurate, and heaven knows it's the water community, the water world that I've been involved in with multiple decades that has made the greatest generalization and mistake by talking about 500-year events. Right? So I understand the need for accuracy and how important accuracy is. But when you go overboard on accuracy to the point where your communication is dense and not understandable, you have sacrificed accuracy for understanding. Sacrificed understanding for accuracy. Let me say that correctly. We can't afford that. We must be understood. And to be understood, we have to first be heard, and means we need to understand the other partner's frame of reference, their message. Okay? Yes?
And one real example of that, when I first came to the department 10 years ago, we used to issue public information pieces. The first sentence, the first paragraph, we used the term benthic macroinvertebrates. And the first thing I said was, why don't we just say bugs in the water? Because it's not accurate. I said, do you think the public cares how accurate that is? They understand what a bug in the water is. They have no idea what a benthic macroinvertebrate is.
We were just working on the Clyde Greenbelt Master Plan, sat down with a homeowners association, and a colleague puts up a board, and about the first words out of his mouth are riparian corridor. Riparian corridor, what's that? A guy says. Well, it's the Greenbelt, the thing we're talking about. So we have to be really, really careful with our interest in having some level of jargon and accuracy. My favorite is, the water world is full of all of these little quirky things. One more example, we're working on the Walnut Creek Watershed Master Plan. And we have in that plan language about water classifications. Well, you can have a partial support of fish in the stream, right? And then your system can fully support that partial support of the fish in the stream. So I'll try and explain that to the public for a moment.
Why didn't you?
Yeah. Yeah. Editing these things is a nightmare. So at any rate, oops, sorry. The other thing I wanted to get to then was this idea of accuracy at the expense of understanding. And the last thing I want to touch on before I turn it over to Dr. Cruz so we can do a little discussion is the word credibility. What makes a scientist credible?
Honesty.
Honesty, good. What else? Experience, good. What else?
Degrees.
Ethics, good. What else?
Degrees.
Degrees can make a difference, yes, in your credibility. Don't get me started. Yeah. How far they have to come, that makes them more expert, I get it. What else?
How will they communicate?
How well they communicate. Why do you say that, Dr. Cruz?
Because I'm panicking after you. Could people engage with those that communicate well? The public engages with those that communicate well. The other ones, they turn and walk away.
The idea that you are credible because you're talking at some higher level or higher plane with more knowledge and more expertise than that other person does not support your credibility. There are countless studies on this. At one point in time, I was a jury consultant, and a fine, fine professor from this very institution came to me and said, pulls up a big stack of papers, puts it down in front of me, and he says, you know, I'm an expert witness, and I've never been on the winning side of a case. Pops these papers down, and he says, I give these to the lawyers every time, and they never ask the right questions. Okay, doctor, we will work on getting this pile down to a couple of pages so that the lawyers will be better informed on how to ask you some questions. And then I proceeded to ask him some questions like you would get on a witness stand. Guess what came out of his mouth? Rotary-powered vegetation turning device. I said, Professor, do you mean lawnmower? Why, yes, I mean lawnmower. Next time, say lawnmower. He called me a couple of weeks later to say he had finally been on the winning side of a case. He was so convinced that his expertise, that his jargon, that his interest in accuracy would be the piece that would drive his credibility, that he lost sight of the fact that the number one thing is you need to be understood. He was not understood. So we have to begin with that basic fundamental piece. Now I would submit this, that the power of your science will be directly proportional to the quality of your communication. So I think what we want to make sure we do is we know our audience, we understand where they're coming from, not just know their demographics, but understand their perspective and what their thoughts might be and what their different ideas might be walking into that room. And then we tailor our fundamental message in a way that they can accept and understand. Is that going to come from us standing up there and preaching to them, no matter how jargon-free and simple our language is? Probably not. What have I tried to demonstrate for you here over the last 10 minutes? Tried to ask you some questions, didn't I? Is this a presentation, or is this more an engagement? Okay? Trying to get you engaged. You will find, I often say to audiences, you want to go home on time? Participate. So it's very important that we kind of lose sight of the fact that we're supposed to be the expert in the front of the room espousing. This is just what the good doctor just told us, right? That's not our role. That's not our job. Our job is to connect, to engage, and to do it in a way that everybody's ultimately going to understand our key message. So, for a quick review before we bring Dr. Cruz up and give him a little critique, what are some of my key messages?
Know your audience.
Know your audience. What else? Speak plainly. What else?
Come out from behind the podium and engage me.
Come out from behind the podium and engage. Good. And let me offer just one last little tip. Pardon?
I asked Rick if he's taking notes.
He doesn't need to. One last thing and then I'll shut up. There's this one little thing that's really huge that engineers and other scientists and applied scientists do over and over and over again. And it's that we assume logic applies. It does not often apply. So in journalism, we call it burying the lead, where we take our most important piece of information and it's in the bottom of the story and you have to read the whole story to get there. How many times do we do this with our scientific communications? Oh, if only they understand everything we went through to get to our recommendation and conclusion, they will surely have followed our logic and be with us all the way. No, they're just mad by the time they get there because they've had to read all this stuff and they didn't care. Don't bury the lead. Put the key finding, put the recommendation, take ownership, get it up front, and then back it up if you want to. But don't water down, unintended, your message by thinking you're going to logic somebody into support. Don't go there. My last little tip. With that, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Cruz, let's see how he does with climate and sustainability, and we'll give him a little critique because we are going to participate. Right? Dr. Cruz.
Pat, did you ever take an agronomy class?
I got an A.
Who was teaching that class?
You did.
Who evaluated you?
You did.
And I gave you a what?
An A.
Okay, remember that. Remember that. Okay, are we okay time-wise and whatever? You're okay, you're the boss. You can miss this seminar too if you want, not a problem. Okay, so we got two of them here. Okay, my assignment is, and every time I listen to Pat talking, I'm throwing this page away and I'm throwing that page away and I was going to say this, I'm throwing that away too. So anyway, so what is climate change to you? What does climate change to you?
More variable weather patterns.
More variable weather patterns.
More extreme weather. Increased frequency of extreme weather.
Increased frequency of extreme events. So the word increased suggests what? It's different than what's happening. Okay, the point is it's already happening. Okay, so climate change suggests a change relative to something that exists today, and human beings, wanting to be melodramatic, we frequently use the word extreme. It could be more mellow. Unfortunately, that's not what we're seeing. Okay, so why should we believe? Why should we even think that climate change is occurring? How many of you have really looked at data? Okay, so there's some. How many of you have not looked at data but have drawn some type of conclusions or thoughts relative to whether or not it exists? So what do you base it? Okay, experience. Experience of a lifetime, but probably the oldest one in here. But, okay, so experience. How many times you meet somebody, do I meet somebody, those that have looked at data, engage in climate change, and the answer is, do you believe in climate change? Well, you know, that's kind of like a question about, do I believe in Santa Claus coming down the chimney? Or believe in the Easter egg? Or believe that Elvis Presley is running around the hills yet in Tennessee? If the issue is you have to believe, and there's an element of trust. Also trust. Those that listen to folks like myself on occasion or others here that have some knowledge about this, they have to trust in what you're saying. And part of the point that Pat made is you have to be willing to engage in a way that they will listen to you, not listen to you, engage with you. When you try to preach, game is over. The Millennium Group. We have some high school kids here, right? When you're looking or sitting here listening, how long before, in a free situation, you would go, if you're not interested in what's being said? Be honest. Yeah, not interested. 20 minutes, you're lying. Probably the 2, I think, is right. But 0. Today's people, today's society, culture, the people you're talking to require entertainment. They don't require entertainment, they require a level of interest in what you're saying. If you're not interesting, if you're using acronyms, vocabulary that's not understand, don't have the right message, game over. Okay, so back to climate change. How might you engage with someone that is a doubter, not that that's bad, in climate change? Are you going to sit there and tell them, you know, this? No. One of the best things is asking questions. Asking questions. What type of questions would you ask? One, and it reflects back on you, is, are global temperatures increasing? That's a question that kind of puts someone in a corner. If the answer is no, and you don't debate with them, but you ask, the next question is so the thermometers that are being used are simply broken. Okay, then another opportunity is, okay, so do you understand that the global temperature is raising? We have that, that's documented, that's rock science, that's solid. But do you understand that the nighttime temperatures are raising faster than the daytime temperatures? So what does that have to do with it? Okay, have you ever left a car outside at night, middle of the fall, and the temperature gets cold? If you see frost form on that windshield when it's cloudy or when it's clear? Clear. Why? Why not when it's cloudy? Okay, people understand that. Clouds trap heat.
I didn't hear what you said.
Oh, I'm sorry. I said clouds trap heat. Clouds trap heat. Okay. So now, the fact that the temperature is rising more at night than during the day, what does that suggest relative to heat trapping? Something is holding it in. Okay, so what is the something? Okay, now we're in disengagement with carbon dioxide and gases that tend to hold heat in. Okay, so the point I want to make with this is that asking questions, my mind is, you're listening because I want for feedback on it, is the best way, one of the very best ways to educate. When people are asked to respond to a question, they're engaged. When you try to hammer them with information, that's just a fact of life. We like to be entertained, we like to be engaging. Okay, the future of climate change and what does it mean for soil and water resources? Okay, now I'm looking at a crystal ball. Now you're going to have to trust me. The storms that we're experiencing, I've heard people say this before, are they more gentle? Are they more intense? More intense. Something else the science is telling us is that there are more dry days between rainfall events. There's more dry days between rainfall events, and we talked about intensity, but what about the amount of rainfall we're getting annually? In this location, it's gradually rising. We got that to show that. Now, if the precipitation is going, if we're getting increased amounts of precip, and the space between events is greater, what does that tell you about the events themselves? Again, now what are we observing? Yeah, I've been meeting with farmers. I've been giving talks to farmers one after another, basically, the last few weeks about soil erosion and what is the story I hear from them without me mentioning it. What do we do to handle, relative to soil resources and water, these 4, 5, 6, 7-inch rains? How do we handle them? But we don't step over and say, okay, that's climate change. Some are into it, some are not. So my answer to that question, and I'm going to sit down. Is that enough to critique so far? You guys got enough fodder? Is that we need to build systems. Remember the talk we heard this morning by Brett about urban? Can we get zero discharge? How did they do it? What did he recommend? Say it again. Make them natural. Okay, that's part of it, but did he rely on one solution? No, combinations. To be resilient in the face of the changes that we're seeing, experiencing, and very likely to see in the future, are to construct systems. In the agricultural landscape, we're going to have to do it with systems. A single practice won't do it. And one other quickie relative to climate change that I've used, and I've just mentioned it here, that works for those people who want to communicate, is What happens to a fluid? Okay, there's a word that grabs people wrong right away. What happens to a fluid? And they say air is a fluid. When you add energy to that fluid, what happens to how stable it is? It gets less stable. Okay? What happens because there's more energy? What happens to the atmosphere, which is this energy? What happens to the energy level as the atmospheric temperature rises? You get more instability, more energy. What is it that fuels hurricanes, thunderstorms? It's energy. It's energy, instability. So the whole issue of why it's occurring is dealing with energy, it's dealing with changes we're seeing in the atmosphere, and we've got to be prepared to address it. Amen?
Let's take just 5 minutes, and then I think we want to do Q&A, right? And do we have some comments for Rick related to his presentation, things that we thought he did particularly well, and some recommendations we might have for him in the future when he started to talk about climate change? Remember, you want to get out of here in time, Dr. Fields.
I like your PowerPoints. Brown, raising. I mean, if we just stand there without using a few gestures, we think we're a little more credible somehow. And drawing the picture in the air is very powerful. Thank you.
Very good. Yes.
The way Ricky's voice got soft, he spoke softly and also loudly, so that when you speak softly, it kind of pulls you in.
So there's some level of volume change and inflection change that can bring some interest to the presentation. Good. What else?
Easy to understand discussion about the car cross, something a very complex issue, and talking about it on a level like that.
That's not good for you. You bet.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes we get overwhelmed with questions that seem to be beyond our heads or beyond what our capacity is. But then if you're able to ask questions that are at a level where they make the audience comfortable and feel like they can answer, and then that's a lot more engaging than something that seems too complex.
I agree.
And one of the things you did that was so strong with that was your questions led directly to your very cool analogies that were easy to understand. Yeah. What else?
Well, even though we're all under control of believe in climate change, look at the data, no way you need to go and not care about the data. It was more, well, this is how I think we're going to get others and connected that anything. I'm going to say something related to that because I think that's one of the things that's missing up on this board is emotion. Right? All of this becomes so much more important when you're talking about or talking with stakeholders who either don't believe you or who are highly, highly upset. Right? They are really upset. And you come at them with data and jargon and numbers. I have a 4-year-old daughter, and if she's really upset and I start to explain to her why the logic behind my decision matters at that moment in time, she will freak out. I mean, it just escalates. And so I think that one of the advantages of being in this room and giving the talk that you just gave is that you're with a friendly audience. But if you're dealing with an audience that is not friendly, what you did is even more important, right? Because you have to first calm, say, I hear you, I understand where you're coming from, reflect values back, reflect beliefs back, say, I understand why those matter, and then you can talk about the data, about that, especially when you're getting to a difficult audience.
If I can echo that, then is that, and Pat said it, you said it, and I tell students, you heard me say that, Tim has, you have to put yourself in the audience's chair before you start talking. Don't want to do it, but you have to get.
I would not have told them that I didn't believe them because they may not want to answer my question.
Okay, good. Good point. Would you answer another question? Depends what the question was. Okay, so it's got to be the right one. Something that's not intimidating.
Any other comments for Dr. Cruz? I would like to offer just one last little journalist read before we take some Q&A. And it's a presentation basic. And I'm sure some of you have heard it, but it's always worth a reminder. And that is, and you did a beautiful job of it, tell them what you're going to tell them, and tell them what you told them. And it's a really important thing if you want to have some level of effective communication, to make people understand the kinds of things they're going to be hearing, walk them through it, and then do that reminder. She did a beautiful job with it. In our case, we were trying to, what did you learn, do the review together at the end, and here we're doing it somewhat again in Dr. Cruz's case. So that's a very important
What is this guy
read.
you keep talking about?
Oh, poor.
There we go. Now.
Yeah. So with that, we have a few more minutes for questions or anything else you wanted to do.
Yes.
Yeah, I think this was meant to be like a discussion. Anything, it's totally open at this point for about 15 minutes, question and answer. So I think it was meant to be a discourse between the audience and our speakers. So feel free to ask anything.
This is offered. The challenge that we all have, and it's institutional in the science community, is we teach our future scientists in a way that traps them into those traps. You know, they're sent to professional conferences to speak in very impressive terms and jargon, and so we train them to be communicators to those professional associations. We train them to write to professional journals, and then we turn around and send them to the wolves, to the public, and we say, why can't you communicate? Well, because we didn't do an effective job in teaching them. And this is something that bugged me throughout my career. I learned because I had the fortune of being closely affiliated with a journalism major for a long time, and she taught me a lot to communicate and write differently. And the first time I gave a presentation at a professional conference, I was so out of the box from everybody else, and yet it was the most well-received presentation because I tried to apply those journalistic and communication skills that weren't being taught to me in my science classes. And to me, if we're going to be successful, we can't wait till we get up there and we become the Dr. Cruzes and the Pat Boddies to learn this. We've got to teach them back in high school and in college when they're learning the science, also how to learn how to translate the science for the general audience. And when we start doing that in our college curriculums, we'll be much better able to do what we said we would.
How do you do that? How do you,
You know, it's
You major in
funny.
wildlife ecology with a certificate in environmental
You
communication.
make sure that, you know, we require students to take, you know, an English class. There's basic requirements that we make them take no matter what. You know, I came from a liberal arts college, so I was forced to take a lot of things that were outside of the science, which I'm looking back on, every science student should be. They should be forced to take a lot of the liberal arts curriculums to learn these things. I've also said, having worked for and with government for most of my career, and we were joking about this yesterday with our EPA colleague, we're environmental scientists, and yet we spend most of our time doing budgeting and contract management and contract law and things we never learned in school. We learned through the school of hard knocks by doing them. And so we also make it hard for ourselves to be effective environmental policy managers when we don't get trained in those skills in college. We're trained in the hard sciences, and all those other elements are forgotten. And so I think we need to look at expanding our science curriculums to include those, what I call the soft sciences, the social skills, the business skills, because you're going to need those if you're a scientist and you're going to be effective and successful.
Well, from a communication standpoint, I'd recommend we quit calling it the soft sciences. Because when we call it the soft sciences, then the hard scientists don't want to take the classes.
Fair enough.
So I think it's really important that we recognize that the scientists of the future, scientists of the present day, needs to be as much an effective communicator as they need to be an effective researcher. And I'm not sure that we really pitch that until we get pretty late in the game, which is toward your point.
I actually had that same question from I gave a talk to the graduate student agronomy group a while back, and one of the things the student said is like, how am I supposed to do all of this? And I said, look, I'm not saying that you yourself have to do everything, but just as you mentioned that you have a partner who
is really good at journalism, right? Find somebody in your life, find somebody at the institution that you're at who can do these things. Partner with them, work with them. Don't put them on a grant as a last minute add-on, which is I get called in graduate school. I cannot tell you how many times the wildlife ecology students would come to me and say, okay, I want to do a survey. It's like a small half paragraph of my dissertation. Can you teach me how to do it in 10 minutes? No, like I can't. So put those people on your grants immediately when you first sit down and start thinking, I want to understand this watershed. Well, people are part of that watershed, so you need to have a social scientist on your grant and involved in your project from the get-go and not as an afterthought. And so I think that's a big part of it too, is modeling that for your students and telling your students, like, if you're going to write this grant, NSF wants interdisciplinary teams right now, and for a long time they have. So find that team, the person that can help you communicate your science. There are great science communication classes at Iowa State. Plug for my class. And there are other ones that are also fantastic. I just know mine. So there are classes out there that they can take, and there are opportunities. So there's a science communication colloquium group now. There's a lot of stuff going on. So if you're interested in putting your students or pushing your students forward, please let me know. I have information.
I think an interesting point to make about scientists and engineers communicating to the public is one of temperament. In my firm, we would take different businesses through temperament analysis as a team, so we can build teams, how do we best interact with each other, who are the people that you don't just bargain on a property because they really need to process. And it was interesting to me how similar all of the temperaments were most of the engineering scientists. I happen to be an engineer and have the completely opposite temperament, but that type of temperament, I think we need a different approach within STEM framework to get them to communicate. Most of the time they're very committed to details, and it's difficult to see a bigger picture. I know many of them really worked at it, but really considering understanding the audience versus writing for academic journal. So I guess that's the next question for you guys. How do we best target that temperament in your education, other than just making it an environment that they have to sit through?
That's a good question. I don't know if I can answer that one off the top of my head. You got a thought, Ian? Yeah.
I think academic advisors can really do their students a service by encouraging them in their extracurricular activities to think about things and stretch them in ways that their classwork doesn't. I think that the two young women that you had stand up before the group this morning was a good example. The technical people doing communication, or a psychology major getting involved in a science that wasn't psychology. My son was an electrical engineer. He was on the solar car racing team here at Iowa State. So he worked with design people, with business people, and people that were raising money for the project. I think those kinds of experiences, people need to be gently nudged toward those kinds of experiences.
Yeah, he's saying nudge people toward the experiences that can kind of get them there. I would also submit too, though, not everyone is going to ever feel comfortable standing up in front of a room and walking up and down the aisle, and I don't think those folks should be forced into doing that kind of thing. There's more than one way to communicate. Written communications are still used. We could get better at that. That's probably less painful for some people to learn. And then we just need to be working as part of teams. And someone on that team may have that temperament and that skill set, and it can be fostered. But that said, everyone should have an awareness, I think, of the need and the impact of poor communications versus solid or forthright communications. And, most people can have a temperament that allows them to listen and understand. And maybe they're not the person who gets up in the front of the room at the end after that understanding, but they can perhaps work with a teammate who can do that, but they have some level of understanding. There's more than one way to skin that cat, I think.
And how many basketball players can match what Georgia Yang can do, or Utah? There's a lot of people who play basketball, but some people are more talented at doing specific things. Not everyone can speak like Pat does. Anyone with following a few simple rules can give a good talk. But there are people that have the capacity and capability that really have speaking as a forte.
And I think to that point is recognize your own limits and not try to go beyond what you know you have the capacity to do, and that is finding that ally who can maybe carry that ball for you.
Yes.
That's where the team approach comes in, whether it's sport, metaphor, or in real life.
Yeah. Anne, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I mean, two related things that I apologize if they've already been discussed after this has been started. But I think the power of storytelling is something that the scientific community often forgets, and I think we think more about that now. But stories, and that it's okay to some extent to bring in our values, because people don't change just based on numbers, which scientists have been so good at, collecting the data and piling it up. But, they change based on thinking about how it relates to them, and their emotions, and their families, and their history. And the most effective talks that I've heard over time are ones that connect to people's values and their stories, and leave room for them to think about how that impacts them. And if you think about even the strategies like holistic resource management, that I think is one of the most powerful tools for getting people to think about change, is because it connects to their values and incorporates that into their day-to-day practical routines and strategies for making money.
And I want to offer one other thing as an addendum to that. In terms of communications, we think about written communications, we think about this kind of oral communication, we might start to think about some level of shoulder-to-shoulder interaction, and we certainly are starting to think about social media. But there's still some good old-fashioned, demonstration, hands-on activities, get out there, roll up your shirt sleeves, work together, have those little sidebar nugget conversations that happen when you're doing those kinds of things. Where's Darren? Darren's got his Walnut Creek Watershed Coalition, and they get out there, and the stuff that they're doing and the conversations that they're having, it's one of the more powerful communication tools, and there's little to no formal communication going on. So we've really got to be thinking broadly about communication. So the stories and the data points are a piece of it, and these different tools. But boy, the whole thing adds up to communication. It's a key piece of it.
We're about out of time. So any one last question before I give you a parting shot? The communication issue with water in Iowa right now is huge. It's us and it's them. It's my way or your way, but it doesn't have to be that way.
That was going to be my question, is whether you had a couple of pointers on how to not politicize what you're saying, how to avoid
Ask questions.
putting it out.
Ask questions. Don't tell people what you think. Ask questions.
I would also add to that I was at a stakeholder meeting a few weeks ago. We're doing a series of stakeholder meetings about watershed issues in Fall Creek, and one of the folks between the first meeting and the second meeting had gone back and done some research on the groups that were mentioned in this brochure, and this brochure was part of one of the organizations that we're partnering with had sent us this brochure, and so we've included it in the package. And part of the goal of this this workshop was really to understand what people are thinking about. And so we hadn't given much thought to this brochure, but she went back and she did the research, and she came back ready to give us an earful about what she thought about our project. And we aren't really even affiliated with this group. And so I would say that one way I engaged with her in that very thing is I just sort of heard that there was this discord going on, and I sort of put myself in the space. I didn't even engage really. I just kind of wandered over and I was doing stuff, and then I sort of made eye contact. How are you doing tonight? Can I ask you a question, like sort of immediately? And we started talking, and I just listened, and I just let her tell me everything that was on her mind. And I could see that after she had sort of released that she was like, oh, okay. And I said, well, I'm really sorry that you were so upset by this. Do you have any sort of specific questions that you would like me to talk to the group about? Maybe we could talk about some of the things that we could clarify better. And I just sort of apologized right off the bat and made eye contact and tried to be as calm, even though like what she was saying was really, there were moments where I was like, oh, I'm really upset that this is what she thought. You just kind of, sometimes you just have to put that aside. You have to take your ego and you have to shelve it and you have to say, hey, I may have messed up here.
And sometimes apologizing, however comfortable you are with making, there are different ways that you can say it where it's not really an apology, but it, you know, however you can say it in a way that allows, helps the person understand that you're human too. And I think that can go a long way into reducing, even with authorship conflicts, whatever conflict you have, right? Say, okay, here, I hear what you say. Here's my question back to you. Is this what you're saying? Getting that clarification in a way that sort of takes the ego and the frustration, the anger out of it, I think can really help.
I think an overarching word that captures a lot of that is empathy. Have empathy with your audience. Have empathy with the person you're talking to. If you do that, you can break down a lot of barriers.
Thanks, everybody. We have 10 minutes, I think, for the final plenary. Yes, and then the party.